Hi, thanks for joining me. My name is Brenda and I'm with Cottonwood Ranch. In this video, I am going to show you what is considered to be perfectly acceptable wind conditions in the state of South Dakota for spraying glyphosate, 2,4-D, and dicamba on a field when there are sensitive trees or sensitive plants directly downwind. But first, I'd like to give you a quick background as to what our property is about so you can have a better understanding of why this topic is so important to us. This piece of property we have dedicated primarily to pheasant habitat. My husband's passion has always been to establish habitat for wildlife. He had a vision for this property when it was purchased, and over the past 20 years he has created a flourishing wildlife habitat. What was once pasture land and a bit of farmed ground has been completely transformed into a wildlife habitat haven. He planted a number of shelter belts, he planted food plots, corn, sorghum, millet, you name it. He put in alfalfa to bring in insects for the baby chicks. He planted nesting grasses, he put in stands of wheatgrass, stands of switchgrass. He had completely transformed this land and he created an incredible wildlife property. And then everything changed on September 3rd, 2019. On this particular day in September, an applicator was out spraying herbicide on a neighboring property across from ours on a day where the winds were extremely high and blowing directly into our property where we have over 10,000 trees. I felt like this was such a reckless application of herbicide, but in the years that followed, we came to find out that South Dakota thinks nothing of it. In this video, I'm going to show you what is considered to be perfectly acceptable wind conditions for spraying glyphosate, 2,4-D, and dicamba in the state of South Dakota on a field when there are sensitive trees directly downwind. Let's take a look. This first video clip, you can see the applicator in the sprayer just to the left of the road there, and he's spraying a tank mix of glyphosate, 2,4-D, and dicamba. In this second clip, you can see again the applicator in the sprayer near the top of your screen. He's still spraying. This is just a couple minutes later from the last clip I showed you. And then if you look to the right of the road, that's our property, and you can see the blue stem just whipping in the wind there. And if you look toward the bottom of the screen, you can see just how strong the wind gusts are. The blue stem is whipping in the wind down there, and if you look in the ditch, you can see the brome grass just kicking up in all directions because of the wind gusts. Now mind you, this goes on for an hour. This applicator has already been spraying for roughly 30 minutes and he's got another 30 minutes to go. So you can imagine our horror when we looked through the video cameras and saw our neighbor out spraying on a day where that was so incredibly windy. At the time, we didn't really know what to do. We did some research and we found out that you can file a herbicide drift complaint form with the South Dakota Department of Ag, and so that's what we did. It's called a pesticide incident form, and I filled out this form. I gave the Department of Ag the date, the time, the conditions, the location, everything that they needed, and they came out to investigate. And when they were out there, they took a number of photos, and then they took a couple of lab samples. They took leaf samples from our trees and sent them into the lab for herbicide testing. And when we got the results back, the herbicide levels in our trees were off the charts. So we had two separate lab samples. The first sample came back, it had 1,010 parts per billion of 2,4-D, which is 200 times the detection limit. It had 223 parts per billion of dicamba, which is 223 times the detection limit. And it had 126 parts per billion of glyphosate, which is 12 times the detection limit. And the second lab sample had 481 parts per billion of 2,4-D, which is almost 100 times the detection limit, and 58.1 parts per billion of dicamba, which is 58 times the detection limit. I received a letter from J.D. Farley with the South Dakota Department of Ag. He is the compliance and enforcement specialist with the Department of Agriculture. The letter was super vague and it said something to the effect of, "Thank you for your cooperation in this matter. The investigation is now closed. If you feel that you or your operation have been damaged, basically you can pursue civil litigation. And if you have any questions, here's our phone number." I contacted the Department of Ag again. I emailed J.D. Farley asking for the investigation records from start to finish. My request was denied. Evidently, the state of South Dakota has a law in the books that does not allow that information to be disclosed. He then said that he provided us with lab samples that showed which chemicals were detected on our property, and he concluded by saying they determined through their investigation that no violations occurred from any of the applicators or any applicators nearby. We could not understand what was going on or how that could be, considering we had lab samples that were off the charts where 2 of the 3 herbicides we had never used on our property. So we ended up going to trial, and a jury of 12 in federal court, it was U.S. District Court in Aberdeen, South Dakota, watched that video just like you did here and determined that this is what a reasonable person exercising reasonable care would do. Despite the high winds that you saw in this video and the risk of these herbicides drifting, and despite the potential damage to sensitive trees and sensitive plants directly downwind, the South Dakota Department of Agriculture and a jury of 12 in U.S. District Court in Aberdeen, South Dakota both consider these high winds to be absolutely acceptable wind conditions for spraying glyphosate, 2,4-D, and dicamba. What was once an incredible wildlife habitat changed dramatically in the years that followed. That's all I have for now. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch.